Thank you very much, Professor. Merci, mesdames et messieurs. It's great to be here in Davos and to have this opportunity to contribute to your discussions on some of the vital issues that are confronting the world today. Some of them are complex and they may at times seem abstract. But for ordinary men and women everywhere, the substance of what we talk about here translates into simple realities, like a home, food on the table, or a better life for their children. So it's an important debate, one that we're delighted to be part of. I should also like to welcome some other members of our government, my government, that are here today, my friends and colleagues. Finance Minister Jim Flaherty is here, Minister of International Trade Peter Van Loan, of course, Ambassador Santi, and also Governor of the Bank of Canada, Mark Carney. Welcome to all of you and to all the other Canadian delegates who are here today. I'd also like, Professor, to take a moment to offer my personal congratulations to you on this, the 40th annual gathering of your creation, the World Economic Forum. You chose as its motto, committed to improving the state of the world. I would observe that few who have set such a lofty goal have more reason to be pleased with their accomplishments. To have conceived of the need for such an institution as this required insight. To have established it took commitment, but to have then nurtured it as a podium from which business and political leaders could nudge public policy by addressing their peers from around the world, that is a formidable achievement, and Professor, this gathering salutes you. Professor, while it has been a long time since the first meeting of this forum 4 decades ago, our circumstances today have something in common with the world in the years following 1971. Economies then were in turmoil. The institutions governing international finance were failing the test of crisis. And wherever one looked around the world, there was trouble. So it is today. The latest crisis hit as the world was grappling already with enormous challenges: large current account imbalances, aging populations in advanced countries, violence, terrorism, and of course the eternal problems of poverty and underdevelopment. There's always something, but we must never stop trying to improve the state of the world. Therefore, in June, when Canada hosts the leaders of the G20 and the G8 in Toronto and Muskoka, respectively, our goal is to work with our partners towards practical and durable solutions. In the next few minutes, I want to share some of the principles that will guide the Government of Canada and hopefully the discussions at these summits under our theme, Recovery and New Beginnings. Let me first talk about the G20 itself, which at Pittsburgh we officially designated as the world's premier forum for economic cooperation. In that role, the G20 will stand or fall on its ability to demonstrate in the months to come the same cooperative spirit it has shown over the past year. Now, I am hopeful. Beginning in Washington in November 2008, G20 leaders have responded to the systemic financial collapse and the global recession with quick, decisive, and coordinated action. At the London Summit in April 2009, these measures were expanded with a particular emphasis on the most vulnerable states, so that in Pittsburgh, the seeds of a new era of balanced, sustainable growth were planted. If I may be indulged in a personal recollection, what I saw at the Washington Summit made an enormous impression on me. Nations whose interests have often been at odds, nations with different traditions of governance, rivals, even former enemies, found themselves addressing common problems with a common will. In this globalized economy, they recognized that a flood engulfing one would soon swamp them all. So even though 20-some leaders all represented sovereign states, they agreed to common and synchronized actions to chart the same course toward calmer waters. Ideological differences were set aside, old enmities were not raised. I would say this: if you had arrived from another planet, you could never have guessed which nations had spent decades mired in hostility. Now, you might call it the Fellowship of the Lifeboat. But ladies and gentlemen, in that brief parting of the veil, I saw world leadership at its best, a glimpse of a hopeful future, one where we act together for the good of all, the world we have been trying to build since 1945, the world we want for our children and grandchildren. It shows it can be done if we act together, and I call this enlightened sovereignty. And I believe our understanding in Washington, just in Washington, allowed us to avoid the cataclysm that otherwise really would have come to pass. But an agreement to act is just a start. It is acting on the agreement that matters. So when the G20 resumes in Toronto, the discussion should be less about new agreements than accountability for existing ones, less about lofty promises than real results, less about narrow self-interest in sovereignty's name than an expanded view of mutual interest in which there is room for all to grow and prosper. Enlightened sovereignty, then, the natural extension of enlightened self-interest.
To be succinct, the real test of the G20 going forward is that it develops and sustains among its members a sense of shared responsibility towards the global economy. That is enlightened sovereignty.
The real test of the G20 going forward is that it develops and sustains among its members a sense of shared responsibility toward the global economy. For while the market's awesome power to generate and widely distribute wealth is self-evident, we also know from history that markets do need governance. And for the new global economy, the G20 is today what we have. Now, as we work through the final stages of the recession and embrace recovery, there are three critical areas where G20 actions have been and will remain vital: financial sector reform, stimulus programs, and global trade and growth strategies. Let me begin with reform of the financial sector, reform of financial sector regulation. This has been a focus since Washington because, after all, that sector's failures and the transmission of its contagion globally are widely acknowledged to have triggered the crisis. Now, as many of you know, and Professor, you were kind enough to mention once again, Canada was not a part of the problem. Canadian banks had maintained healthy leverage ratios and largely avoided exposure to toxic assets. No major Canadian financial institution failed, and none required bailouts from the government. As a consequence, Canada now has one of the largest banking sectors in the world, and it is entirely in the private sector. I should just note that reputable observers have recognized this Canadian advantage. As you said, Professor, this year as last, your own eminent organization, the World Economic Forum, and more recently, Moody's Investors Service, both ranked Canada's banks as the world's soundest. The International Monetary Fund has commented that, let me quote, that Canada's financial sector has shown, quote, remarkable stability amid the global turbulence, thanks in good part to strong supervision and regulation, unquote. This is undoubtedly part of the reason why Canada took on the co-chairmanship of financial sector regulatory reform at the first G20 in Washington.